Hi, welcome to another Kensuke Conversations. And this evening we're speaking to Nigel O'Mara again. Nigel, if you've watched some of our previous podcasts, was one of the founders of Survivors UK back in the mid-80s, which is a long time ago now. And we had some really interesting conversations with Nigel in the first podcast. And there are themes that emerge from that we thought, actually, Nigel, would you like to come back and explore them? And it was so much about the past and the history of male survivor service development, but about where we are now and the future and the issues that are facing male survivors, the good, the bad, and the gaps, basically. Nigel, I think you might want to give us a quick introduction to yourself. And we can.
Hi, good evening, I'm Nigel.
That's a very quick introduction.
I thought you gave a good description of me first.
Let's start where we were talking previously, just before we started recording. And, where are male survivors in the United Kingdom? There are some very big services that have developed and much better than they were 20 years ago. But there is what you were talking about, which I think often isn't talked about, is the vast areas of gaps, especially in rural areas where there are no services. And where there are services, there are weak female services. And some of them work with male survivors, but they don't often offer a choice of gender for males. And, that's where we're at. So what's your views about all of that?
Well, I think one of the problems with that is that the police and crime commissioners don't actually have a remit which says they have to provide services for both types of survivors. Which, because the waters are very muddy, it means that some police and crime commissioners don't give it the priority that maybe it should get.
I mean, one of the issues has been since the dawn of the violence, it's women and girls strategy, must be 15 years ago now, which is a welcome, massive step for our society.
Yeah, absolutely.
To actually put that into a document. But the issue for males was males were kind of in it, but vanished. Even the statistics were kind of homogenized. And that led to a complaint to, I think it was the National Audit Office, who had to intervene with the Home Office, I think it was at the time, because it was basically they were acting against the law by doing what they were doing in relation to homogenizing the stats, because it basically vanished. Male victimization.
Well, they said that it was violence against women and girls and boys. The men and boys has been dropped off again.
Yeah, it's kind of gone through lots of iterations, but it was kind of children as well is the language that's used. And the issue with that is that some would argue that, children vanishes the particular experiences of boys, because boys have been brought up in a kind of environment where it is different. So, I'd say the majority of trauma in sexual violence, 80% of it is the same, whether you're male or female. But there is that 20% that's linked to socialization, which makes a fun and real difference to all of us, wherever our sex or gender or, non-gender specific identification is. Socialization is a powerful force on our minds and the way we see ourselves and the rest of the world. And, psychologists, have written thousands of papers on that. So it's kind of to ignore it and disappear it and homogenize it as if male only emerges when we start to produce certain levels of hormones in adolescence, is to kind of miss something. Is that for males, that process is going on from the moment they emerge from the womb, in the way mothers interact with them, the way the world interacts with them, the way they begin to perceive the world. And hormones are just part of that journey. So when they become able to have erections and they become able to act as mini adults, that's one part of the process. But at 6 or 7, they're beginning to see themselves differently to the girls around them, not so much because of the changes in the hormones, or because they're becoming more aware of the subtleness of the way the world sees them. And I don't think homogenizing them into one strategy solves problems. I think it creates further problems. And I think you need to have a separate strategy for males. It used to be, I used to think it was a sexual violence strategy for males, because that's my kind of focus. But now I'm more open, very open-minded about it being a wider strategy about interpersonal violence against males, and their needs as victims, wherever the interpersonal crime that's committed against them.
I think the other thing is that because society doesn't hear about violence against men, sexual violence against men, it's as very often just called the Violence Against Women and Girls campaign, which is right. I mean, the fact is that 90% of people who are abused are women, and I don't deny their services whatsoever. All I'm saying is that we should have a step in the room. We should have a place there for male survivors to also be part of the solution, and we're excluding them from being part of that solution by ignoring that they exist.
So I think you're right, and I think my argument has been to decision makers is you can't solve this problem called sexual violence, not because male survivors are going to want to be perpetrators, though some do, obviously, the majority don't. They perpetrate against themselves in all sorts of creative ways. But unless you deal with the whole thing, you're not really shattering the societal denial. It's only when you shatter it all and you kind of challenge people to look, which is what Theresa May actually said before the launch of the National Inquiry, when she was asked what she thought the outcome would be. I'm not sure she thought it would be sitting on a shelf, though some of us thought that would happen. But she said the thing that's going to come out of it that will be most important is the society will need to look itself in the mirror. That hasn't happened.
No, it hasn't happened. And I don't think our politicians have let it happen. I don't think our politicians want it to happen.
I think you're right. You can, you worry about, the whole thing was launched when Liz Truss was becoming Prime Minister, wasn't it? So, so they had a big kind, I think it was somewhere near Westminster Hall, wasn't it? It was the QE2 Centre or something, where they launched the report. And I didn't see hardly any coverage. I think Channel 4...
There was no question. I was lined up for 4 interviews that day and they've all got.
So it wasn't important to the media.
Frustrating. It's frustrating because it means that the mainstream media have not picked up on this story, have not followed it up. Because they weren't there for the final report, they haven't got a vested interest in reporting further on it and showing... for example, you've heard about the post office scandal where, and time again, people like Victoria Derbyshire have stood there and said, oh, they haven't had their compensation yet, none of the recommendations have been done yet, even though the inquiry is not even finished. And yet they're not saying anything about the fact that during the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, there were several recommendations made. None of them have been implemented fully. They've all been whitewashed a bit. And we really need some of these recommendations to be implemented properly and in full.
I think that's absolutely on the money. And also, what's surprising to me, and a very rare occurrence in a national public inquiry under the Act, is both the chair of the inquiry and the secretary to the inquiry, who was a Home Office official, are both out there doing public meetings about it. That's almost unheard of. That doesn't happen.
Yeah.
So that goes, and they're not getting any leverage at all, as far as I can see from the media. There is no of the media.
No, the media don't want to know.
Don't want to know, clearly, because that is that didn't happen with Leviston. Didn't happen with any other inquiry. It's almost like a code that once they kind of finish, the chairs disappear into the mist, and then government decides what it does with it. I mean, there's a big, giant conversation to be had about the Inquiry Act. I always remember when it was announced for the National Inquiry, I didn't really know much about National Inquiry Act. So I did some Google searching, and I found, because it's not particularly an old act, because it was
No.
I argued to Theresa May about having a Royal Commission, because it not because Royal Commissions are particularly different, but it kind of attaches the royal standard to it. And I thought that might give it a little bit more leverage, really, because it's a bit harder to kind of bury a Royal Commission. But that's what my rationale for it was. But that was thrown out. So she wrote to me and said, no, she wasn't going to do that. Whereas kind of the Inquiry Act itself, and I remember reading an article from a Canadian judge who'd been flown in, or a retired Canadian judge who'd been flown into Northern Ireland to do some inquiry. And he kind of left within 3 or 4 weeks, which kind of mirrors what happened in the National Inquiry in some ways. And he left a damning verdict on the Act. He said the Act wasn't fit for purpose. It was brand new, and that it didn't really allow for national inquiries because it had A, B, and he listed all the things why he bailed out and wouldn't do it. And and I think, all right, that was an interesting kind of observation. See how that goes. And it's played out. So it leaves males in, and males were in there, weren't they? Because there were a lot of males who gave evidence, and there was a lot of kind of.
That was one of the interesting conversations I had with some of the inquiry staff, was why so many men had come forward to that inquiry. And I think the reason was, and I think what we came out with was, the very fact was that up until that time, females had a way of redressing things by going to a rape crisis centre, etc., whereas males hadn't. They hadn't had that chance yet to go out and speak publicly into an inquiry to take part, whereas this gave them that opportunity, and they took it. And it's right that they took it. So I'm glad I did.
I mean, we are in a political moment about, and rightfully so, that women should be advocating for their protection. So they should. That's going to take that's a war to change that.
Yeah, it is.
The majority of men don't do any harm to females, but the majority of males also act as bystanders. Not that we're directly watching attacks on women, but we kind of know the guys and they listen to the
remarks, and they stand there while things are said or done.
Sometimes I've seen it I've done it myself. You kind of challenge someone about it and say, that's a load of crap, you're talking a load of rubbish. Doing this, which normally with somebody that you don't particularly get on with anyway. So you can you don't mind having a bit of a rumpus with them. But if you're in their gang, if you're in their sphere of kind of whatever, then it's much harder to do because you've got all the other peer stuff going on.
It is much harder to do, but it's our duty to challenge such behaviour. It's our duty as human beings.
So it's no doubt, now that wouldn't be an issue. And I'm talking in my 20s, Nigel, in environments where, we're 40, 50 years ago. So it was different in the sense
as well I know that wasn't the case then.
So reflective about the culture, and that culture is still, I think it's got better probably, but it still exists. And it's the majority of guys just look the other way, don't they? But it is a problem, for women, it's a problem, and girls, it's a problem.
But looking the other way isn't acceptable. It's not the right way.
No, it isn't acceptable. Right. So that's where I'm coming back to what we were saying is, you can't solve the problem unless you solve the problem.
Hopefully we can move this conversation to where it should be. Where it should be is, if you're a real man, you will protect and you will look after other people around you by standing up and challenging bad behaviour. That's what a real man does. So as you get more and more people, not just men, people willing to challenge and people willing to put it out there that that's the normal way to do things actually, then I think society will change slowly.
What's your perspective of it as a young woman growing up and dealing and formed an organisation at Leeds University that was trying to do what Nigel is actually advocating, and you had males who were involved in that as well, and actually stand up and start challenging the behaviours that you and many of your peers would have experienced in university context potentially. The thing that I remember talking to you when I first met you, you and your co-founder Chloe, was you were talking about, and I remember the look on your faces when you were talking about the way that young guys were sharing images of their penises in the library by kind of using the mobile phones and airdropping the pictures of their penis to everybody who was in the library. And you're all sitting there, heads into textbooks and stuff, and you look at your phone to see it, and there's this penis kind of appearing. And there's somebody within 100 feet or whatever the distance is that they have to be to do this airdrop thing, that actually they're in that space with you and they know you're getting it. And I remember your faces. Your faces were absolute horror because it violated you in every single... There was no protection from it, even within the digital transmission. You couldn't escape this abusive harassment, even when you were supposed to be in a place that, you should be the safest you've ever been, in a university library, shouldn't you?
Yeah, I mean, digital harassment is like a whole other sphere of kind of abuse. I think it's not taken as seriously because it's not in the physical space. So people kind of think, oh, well, it's just a phone screen. It can't really cause any harm. It's just a picture. But it is such a intrusive thing to do to someone. It doesn't really matter if it's a physical thing or if it's an image. I think being in Sasha is definitely, it felt really positive. And we actually did have lots of conversations with groups of guys that, I mean, we were expecting to we were running like consent talks and stuff, and trying to get societies that we knew had more guys kind of hanging out together to come along to the consent talks, and just to kind of get them to have a little lesson on consent. And we were actually really surprised that a lot of them were really on the ball with knowing the right things to say. Whether that actually continued into their kind of personal lives and the way that they behaved as a society in their own kind of space where they weren't being judged. I think it's very easy to say the right things, but not necessarily do them and follow through when it comes to it. But we were surprised that people actually did know, which is, in a way, I guess you would say, slightly more disturbing if
absolutely
they know the right things to say and do, but they're not doing that. So it's a hard one. And I think that also does kind of play into the difficulty then for male survivors to be able to speak about their own experiences, because I mean, if you're surrounded by a group of people that you can see are behaving that way towards the women in their lives, or just kind of anyone, you wouldn't have the confidence to say, well, actually that's something that's happened to me, and expect that someone's going to understand that and have empathy and be able to like support you. So I think there's definitely a lot more awareness now, and I think there are a lot of people with the right intentions, and a lot more guys that are willing to call out their friends and say, that's not funny, and even if it is a joke, it like, you don't know who's in this room, and you don't know who's actually taking that joke quite seriously or who that's upsetting. So I think that there's definitely progress being made, but there's still a long way to go.
The threat of change takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. I've seen a lot of changes in society since the 1980s, especially on this issue. Society's changed almost 180 degrees on this issue. They haven't quite got there yet. They're only about 160. But we need to keep pushing. It's not something that is ending. There has to be a way forward, striving to make things better and better and better. There has to be an ongoing process, rather than just a one-off, like the inquiry, rather than just some kind of one-off investigation into it. There should be some kind of national strategy where the information that's out there is gathered by the different organisations. Very often that's unconnectable through their various reasons. The way to make it connectable is to have one organisation that's actually responsible for that, and that pulls that information together and allows us to better see the pattern of people's behaviour and better attack them in the right way societally.
I mean, I was a co-participant at the National Inquiry, and my statement to the inquiry, my recommendation as a survivor was actually, one of them was that you should have a cabinet level minister. But the only way you really deal with this is when it be taken seriously in cabinet, and they actually have a cabinet office. Wherever they sit, there is tasked to coordinate all of it and to have a national strategy, because it's a war, in the same way you would have a war. So I think child sexual abuse, boys and girls, causes more damage to our society than a war would cause in some ways.
How much does it cost for all of the counselling services? How much does it cost for all of the support services that are needed? How much does it cost for all the police action? How much does it cost to keep people in prisons for decades because they've been offending those? Billions and billions and billions. Dealing with this problem, even in a small way, even if you can reduce the actual offending rate of to something like just say 10%, would save billions on the economy. And that's what the governments really have to get a hold of.
But you have to understand how governments, the environment they're having to walk in, and one of the environments that it's vested interests. A senior policy officer, I won't say which government department it was, once told me, over lunch, because we're talking about very similar to what we're talking about now, and they said to me, yeah, well, I get it. This was over 20 years ago. We get it. We're under no illusions that it's an epidemic and that it's impacting everything. But can you prove to me, they said, that if we switch all the funding from all these other areas into this, that we're going to get better outcomes? That it's going to make any difference to people?
This is the problem. You can't.
That's what you're facing, is they're not convinced that the switching of the resources into a different area will have any better outcomes. And the vested interests, we won't name because they're varied and all over the place, kind of feed that, because they say, well, keep it contained.
We're dealing with the symptoms, not the disease.
And and we need to deal with the disease, and you need to kind of go to the heart of it, and you need to explode the cultural denial in ways that, and the National Inquiry not just vanishing in effect. What it did is, whether it's consciously aware, society is consciously aware of what that did, because it vanished and because it ran for 8 years. And it was great for those of you who could tune in and watch the videos or go down and do whatever. And that's great. But the vast majority of people, it wasn't on the news every evening. The Australian one was actually on the news every evening when that ran, prior to the British one.
So was the Irish one.
And the Irish one, the news broadcasters were every evening reporting what was going on, like they do to some. But even now, they don't even do that with the Post Office inquiry. You have to go on to social media to capture some of that, unless you want to tune in. But they kind of said it vanished. And what that does, in my view, Nigel, we talk about males, particularly males are vanished. They're vanished from narratives at the moment, because the political narrative is, we'll talk about women, I get it, so it's great. But actually what you're doing is sending a message to all boys and men that they don't have any value, and they therefore they're not part of the...
They're not worth doing anything.
You can be our ally, but you don't mention us. That's what guys will say. We don't, it's kind of, we're all your allies, but, it's kind of, what about our needs? And not saying that we should suppress your needs, but, if you vanish us, why should we be involved? And I'm kind of doing this stuff, so you've got to think about that. But also, it just told society that this wasn't a big issue. That it was the moral panic, as it's described, isn't it? there was like the moral panic of the explosion of Savile. Then you had the kind of moral panic to run up to the National Inquiry, which, all you can say is in history that if you're going to kind of handicap an inquiry for credibility from the very beginning, is run the way it ran in relation to, was it 3 or 4 chairs before they finally got somewhere? Yeah. So that didn't help. And then you had the inquiry, and then it just ran and ran and ran. And it was very legalistic, and it was kind of great for all of that stuff, if you like that stuff. Very forensic, very collected a massive amount of data that will be useful for hundreds of years in many ways.
Yeah, and that is a use as well.
So it's kind of there as a, I saw it, I remember talking to somebody from Red Crisis, and we were kind of wandering through Leeds after a meeting. This only a couple of years into the inquiry, and we're discussing, chatting about it. Something was going on with the inquiry at the time, I can't remember. And I said, well, what do you think? And they said, well, we agreed that the best, that we could hope for, at the end of the day, if it didn't produce, and we were sceptical about it actually producing anything at the end. It was kind of then it would have a lot of information, a lot of data, so it's a great collection of information and kind of evidence. But if it didn't actually have anything that changed implementation of change, then, it was great for futures and it was there to go back to. But it was, and there were things that I heard later on at the end of it, where all the testimony that was taken from those who'd gone to the Voice Project, whatever it was called, and kind of do the stuff. And that someone then told me that all of that was going to be deleted.
The Truth Project. The Truth Project data has been anonymised. It's been anonymised and put into a data set.
Because that is history. So
that's
it's
a big data set.
So
it will become very useful for researchers.
In the future, the pure data, that's the recordings. Yeah. It's kind of, and in 100 years' time, it's not going to matter to anyone. People could have signed for that to happen. So that in 100 years' time, people can come and have a listen to all that. But there was a big one. I'm glad that didn't happen. But I was here, they were going to delete it all because they were worried about GDPR. So, doing all this kind of stuff.
That's why they anonymised it.
Well, that's really, really good to hear.
And it wasn't the very first thing they did. They did it during the process. And they anonymised it just because of the GDPR, to make sure that everybody was referred to as a number. Although that number could be traced by the actual researchers, obviously, because they had the formula to do it, nobody else could trace it.
So that's right. I agree with that. But you've got documents that are sealed in the National Archive to do with the royal family from 100 years ago, and you can't access them. So we could do that with that. So there's not a big, the system knows how to do it. But there was this idea of kind of deleting them all, and that I heard, and I thought that was just crazy. So the principle is that the argument I'm making is there is what Judith Herman, the author of Trauma and Recovery, American psychiatrist, wrote in the first page of a book, I think, there's this society, it's the unspeakable, and society has this default mode even when you have these explosions, because it's not the first explosion. Savile wasn't the first explosion of this stuff.
No.
Into society, it goes back hundreds of years, and doing the stuff where in the Victorian times, the abuse of children in the tenements is what created Barnardo's in many ways.
Fred and Rose West.
All of these.
Liam Brady.
So you've had these, and the epic scale of it in relation to the system, children's homes, those kind of things. They're kind of schools, different locations, the family itself, and all of that. All of that is kind of known and was known, has been known since the 80s and 70s. There was vast amounts of research done. And when you spoke to researchers in the 90s, the 2000s, and I'd say to them, you were kind of running departments looking at sexual abuse. There was this university had one, that university had one, because it was all exploding in the 70s as the women's rights movement emerged, Reclaim the Night, and all these things, which were really powerful kind of step forwards in cultural challenging of processes of abuse. And they said, yeah, they did. And we wrote tons of papers and went to lots of meetings with politicians and policy officers and central government. And then a couple of years, funding came in, and then they pulled all the funding because they didn't continue it. They allowed it to vanish because it was forcing lots of questions about system change that they didn't want to deal with. They didn't want to have system change.
Yeah, I think one of the advantages here is the fact that this data is obviously now electronic, rather than it wouldn't have been in the 70s and 80s. It would have been held in different formats. Whereas now it's in an electronic form, it's very easy to save a large amount of information.
So let's go back to boys again and gaps. So, we're talking about rural areas, we're talking about, there's a kind of big conversation going on at the moment about, and I'm sure it's going to run on next year, about kind of devolving all funding to PCCs so that they kind of then can act and deal with all these issues. And me and many others concerned about that is that, yeah, you'll get some PCCs and mayors who will deal with it really, really well and kind of be very nuanced and be informed about dealing with it progressively. And there are others who I think you've alluded to in conversations who won't.
Yes, mine is certainly not of that nature.
So what you'll get is a postcode lottery of thing, and it is because I think people are being creative. The analogy I would use is like going to war against Putin because he's invaded he's finally conquered Ukraine, and he's driving across into Poland and to Czechoslovakia and towards Germany and down towards France, and you mobilise all your forces, and then you tell all the colonels and all the brigadiers in charge of battalions and divisions that you're not going to have a central command and kind of manage it with the field marshal and all the other systems and have a strategic approach to the battle. They can all choose which way they get there themselves, and they can have the war and they can just do their own thing and don't worry about anybody else. That's the equivalent of it. And I think, what you need is a concerted strategic approach.
There has to be a strategic approach. If you don't have a strategic approach, you will never get equality across the state.
So we're hoping, aren't we, that there's going to be a strategy for the males. So there would be a strategy, whether that exists in a health strategy for males or it exists within a violence against boys and men strategy, or whatever you want to call it, and doing the stuff. I'm not sure that will happen. But I think there needs to be a strategy for males.
Yes, I think there does, and I think actually, I think there may be progression towards that, though it's not been by any means finalised. I think there are some people making moves towards that who are part of the government party, which helps. There are some people who are on the ball in the government, and I think there could be changes coming along which will recognise, because they need to have an overall strategy, and they're trying to plan an overall strategy, but that's very difficult if you're excluding one part of society. When you're excluding 45% of society, then it becomes impossible.
And I think that's right. So hopefully that is the case, because I don't think the present situation is tenable. You can't solve the problem by, as you say, only dealing with half of it. You need to deal with the other half as well. I actually think that would have a powerful impact on society if you start to deal with it in the whole rather than in bits. Because currently, when males hear about sexual violence, what they really hear is that's only what girls and what women experience. They don't think it really impacts them.
Also going to wake up a bit to the fact that females abused too. That's almost never mentioned unless it's a court case. It's never mentioned as a general form of discussion or part of a discussion. It's always mentioned in particular to a particular case. rather than being seen as this is part of the problem as well that we don't want to miss. The point is not to miss bits, and we keep missing bits. And the reason we do that is because we don't have a strategic authority doing it. We don't have a proper administration to look at these things and bring them together.
We're also in a political world and a funding politics as well. It's political in the real sense of the word, about how we kind of, have debates about what's priorities. That's political. And then you have the politics of funding, which is really about there are limited resources and people are fighting for them. So my conversations with people in the women's movement is privately, when you speak to them, there is no denial about the numbers of female predators in sexual violence. And the figure that I've heard discussed that nobody's pulling their hair about and getting upset about, and that comes from them, is about 20%. Yeah. So, rape, in services where you're dealing with sexual violence, where women are presenting, it's an issue. And they're not,
and they abuse women as well as men.
And anyone who's ever been in women's prison will tell you that, they're not all giving cuddles to each other in those women's prisons, because you can argue about why they behave the way they behave, where that comes from, and often it is from being in abusive childhood experiences. But that's the same for males. So it's males are coming mostly from those experiences who are in prison. So you kind of need to deal with the issue that's there, really. But they, nobody, I know privately when you speak to them, 20%. And it's an issue because it's an issue for male survivor services as well, because you get, a number of what is now being called dual status. I'm not sure what, I'm kind of in favour of that that title, but they kind of, they're that's a big conversation because, they exist. And, again, they might be 20% of survivors. So, if that's the case, they need to be dealt with, don't they? So, and it's how do you deal with them and where do you deal with them? I would argue you don't deal with them within the 80%, where the 80% are. You kind of deal with them in separate services. I don't think you can mix those two populations together.
Well, over the years of counselling that I've done, I have always had, ever since the 1980s, there have always been a 20% of females that have asked me for support because they didn't feel comfortable speaking to a female about the abuse they've suffered. And this has got to be part of the conversation. Nothing's right for everybody.
Absolutely.
The real thing is, we need different types of counsellors who the survivors can identify with and feel that is on their side. And that can only happen by them having a choice, a proper informed choice about who they want to speak to and how they want to speak to them.
So I think that's the issue, is that then becomes the politics of funding. So that, because there isn't enough funding, so then they kind of try to smoke and mirrors it to kind of get clients through the door and forget about what you're really articulating, except, really on target, which is choice. Choice is what's taken away in abuse.
Yes.
When you boil it all down, that is what's taken away, is your choice.
Once your choice is taken away, then you're left with something that you don't feel comfortable with, which means that you don't deal properly with the issues that you've got, which means that you end up with more long-term effects in the end run. If you've got proper services right at the beginning that are appropriate to your needs, appropriate referrals, then you wouldn't have this problem, because people wouldn't have to go through one service, then another service, then another service, because they were able to identify the right service in the first.
And I think that that's really kind of very important to reinforce. I think also that the power of choice is that when taken away from you as a child, and you may well have then colluded with abusers because you needed something from them. You needed a home to live in, you needed food, you needed safety, and therefore people kind of survived, don't they, inside those environments. And if you do that in a therapeutic service, when you think, well, actually, the survivor really wants my service, because they're here, they're telling us they want it. Doesn't mean to say that it's what their true fundamental choice is, because they have no choice. If they want the counselling, and you're saying they can only see female therapists, then they've got a choice, haven't they? Some actually do turn around and say, no, I want to speak to a male. Very few, though, I suspect, because most aren't that bothered. But also, there is something about them not having a choice, I think, that takes something away.
So well, I think it's damaging to ask the question if you can't fulfil the answer. If you're asking the question, who would you like to speak to? I know this happens in my area, particularly in Devon and Cornwall. The survivors are asked, do you want to speak to a male or a female? And then if they say they would like to speak to a male, they're told, no, you can't, because we haven't got any. Now, why ask the question? Why ask the question if you've only got one answer?
Because they're trying to, this is my view of it, because they're being funded by PCCs, others, to they won't get the funding unless they say they'll work with both genders, sexes. So they have to be seen to be doing that. And there's a conversation about choice. And actually the choice is not really real. It's what really matters is you have real choice. So sometimes it's difficult. So, if you ask me for a male survivor and all our male counsellor and all our males are full up, then you only have a choice of a female, because we can't magic people. Same if you want a female and we don't have any female.
What do you think, Nick?
I think everyone deserves that choice of who they want to speak to, because we talk about it all the time, don't we, Rob? Because ultimately, and it's just what you have both touched on, is it's about choice. And even with services, it should be about choice. Survivors should have the choice of who they want to work with, because they've not had that in the past. And I think that offering that shows that this is going to be a safe space for that survivor, and they'll feel comfortable and know that they're in the right place, to offer that and then turn around and say, well, we don't have that. I don't understand what the thought process is there, to be honest. I can understand we, like Rob was saying, we have a mix of female and male. If we have the male counsellors are full, and it might be a bit more of a wait for a male counsellor. I don't think we're ever really put in that position, which is quite fortunate. But then that survivor knows, you can try with a female. If it doesn't work, come back
when there's a male.
Or
maybe in interim measure. To someone to talk to for a while we get talked out with who you actually.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I think it's about just making that survivor feel that this is a place that is supporting them. If you're turning up to a service and you say you want a male counsellor and they say, well, we've only got females and that's the only option for you, immediately you don't feel like you're being listened to. Yeah. So how could you even trust in that service and feel comfortable to share what's happened?
But the services don't seem to get this. They don't seem to get that point clearly. That if you close down people's options as soon as they speak to you, they're survivors. They're going to close down. That's what they do. That's what survivors do. When they're presented with no option, is they withdraw. And then it becomes a problem later on. Mm-hmm. So you're just moving a problem down the line and causing more suffering, actually.
Yeah, and I think as well, if you're running a service that's supporting survivors, I think your main priority is making sure that you're not causing further harm.
Should be, yeah.
And I also, it makes you question who's running these services and what intentions do they have running these services if they don't understand how to support survivors and make them feel seen and feel safe.
Well, I don't think they even comprehend it as an issue, because they've never had to, because it's always been this is the only service we've got.
Mm.
And that's about funding. That's about the way that services are set up, the structure of services across the country, the difference in levels of services throughout the country, which are so variable. It really is a postcode lottery.
Absolutely, yeah. There's national standards, but they're actually really good. So, but there are very few services that kind of reach them, and all the there's consistency of training as well on who's kind of doing what counselling and how that counselling's being delivered. There's lots of questions about sexual violence services that haven't been explored yet in relation to delivery, and that doesn't happen, I don't think, because we've never reached that level of critical mass in relation to delivery across the country. Some services are bigger than others, and they've reached that level, but I'm not sure they're asking those questions. And I think,
well, I think you say about critical mass, that's about having enough services, and there have never been enough services to date. You're talking about young people, children having to wait years before seeing something. And now these should be the priorities that the government is sorting out, because if you intervene at the right time in a young person's life, you can make a lot more difference than waiting until they're later on in their life. You can make a much more positive difference.
Which is what I mean by critical mass. We've not reached that. And to reach it, then you really, really can start to really be even more effective. So most of us services, kind of reach really, really, really good effectiveness, for people who had 6 months of counselling. So that makes a difference. Whether that continues down the road, whether or not, 2 years down the road, that's still maintained, whether it's growing and developing, because of the lack of other services that surround it, no one's really sure, I don't think. So you need to look at all that, but you can't start asking those questions until you reach a critical mass in delivery across a big area. And there's consistency.
Which takes us right back to the beginning about administration.
Mm-hmm.
It is, what do we do to change? How do we make politicians change? I mean, I'm very good at annoying them, but I'm not sure that's a very good thing. But, but that's what you need to do, is annoy them, challenge them.
But I don't think it's only that. It's also, they really don't like it if you can prove that they're not doing something.
Yes.
So if an individual case in an individual area, if you're highlighting that, very often that can change their perspective on what they want to think about.
It is, isn't it? Difficult, isn't it? So, and we remember they're all human beings as well, but many of them are survivors as well, I suspect. So to think, that there aren't lots of survivors in the political class, it would be truly naive. I think there's probably a higher proportion of them are survivors of something than there is in the kind of general population, I suspect. But, why? The question I've asked, you've been around a lot longer than me, Nigel, why do they resist changing? The question just pops into my head all the time about this. You understand the politics and the resourcing battles, because there's only so much money and everyone believes in what they do. Most people, I think, believe in trying to do good. But why the resistance from the state? Why they kind of just...
Because at the moment it's easy to say there's a little pot of money and then have you fighting over it, so you're distracted from fighting about the real problem. And the real problem is the fact that we don't have the administration in the first place. We don't have the system set up to support survivors, especially children, making sure that their outcomes are better. They do that by having a small pot of money. And I've seen so many times when one organisation is pitted against another organisation for the same pot of money, one organisation loses, then they never speak to the other organisation. And we've got to become above that. We've got to get above that. And we've got to get organisations speaking together in the right ways and not treating each other. And sometimes I've seen despicable treatment of survivors by survivors in different groups because they feel that they should have got the funding when somebody else got the funding. And I understand their frustration, but we have to work together. Without being united as a moving force, we won't make the changes that are necessary because the government won't listen to us because they've got us separated and it's nice and easy.
Mm-hmm. It's classic divide and conquer, isn't it?
Yeah.
It
Right.
happens across the board, doesn't it? Because it's just, how do we control these people? Okay, we'll throw them an issue so they're completely distracted by this issue and trying to keep their heads above the water to do what
an issue that divides them. An issue that divides them.
Yeah.
So they don't come to you with a coherent voice saying what they need and what they want. And that's been going on for a long time. Like you say, I've been around with this for 40 years, and it's been going on for an awful long time.
And it's still going on, Nigel. So not many people articulate it, are willing to talk about it, because they're worried about saying it. But what you've articulated still goes on.
And this is the problem. It means that we don't then get a coherent voice. We don't have a real national organisation amongst ourselves, which brings together all the other small organisations to become a federation, to be able to put across a point that's just about the services provided, rather than about an individual service or an individual organisation. And maybe we need to think about looking at that, building a federation of survivor services. And I would suggest it be male and female, because I want the discussion to be with everyone.
And that is happening, isn't it? It happens surprisingly well in certain areas, but you get, this. It's what my observation of it is. I know what your observation is. It's okay as long as federations basically need to be broad churches, so you need to have rules about things, but you need to be able to tolerate people who have different perspectives, as long as those perspectives aren't kind of destroying the overall objective that everyone agrees about the aim.
We're going to hold on to the basic principles of what we're fighting for. And if they're the same, then that's what we fight on. The ones that we're not fighting the same thing on, we leave alone. As a federation, you deal with just the compass points of what you can do as an organisation with the same aim from every single person involved in it, so that we don't get this distraction and this division between organisations. I saw it when the first round of funding was issued by the independent inquiry, not by the inquiry, but as a result of the inquiry, and a lot of organisations suddenly stopped talking to one another afterwards. Why? Because some got funding and some didn't. And that is the sort of thing we can't allow to continue dividing us.
So I agree. The issue you've got is that those who take over whatever umbrellas develop, maybe different rape. Exclude rape crisis for a second because they've kind of been through this process. But for others, it is, if you don't speak the same, you get. My observation of it is that they tend to devolve into what's called groupthink. So if you're in there and kind of have a slightly different view, then you're the kind of enemy and you're kind of pushed out. And then regardless of how valid your perspective is and how helpful it might be to have that discussion, you're not saying, oh, you must do what I say you must do. You say, well, have you thought about it this way? And that is enough to create a tension in a group think. And I think it goes back often with survivors, because survivors don't want the tension of a kind of conflict. So they want everybody to be kind of on the same page often. And especially, and what you also get, I think, is people gravitate towards the leadership of those things who are kind of typical in some ways of people who use power for control and management of things. So they kind of, it becomes their empire. And then once it becomes their empire, they're only really thinking about themselves. They're not thinking about what you're articulating, which is, so it's about me when they're there. It's not about us. And if you join them, you have to be part of me, not part of us. And I think that's the difference.
Yeah, and I think that is something specific. I don't know whether it's specific to civilized organisations, but it's something I've certainly seen a lot. When you see an organisation, you should be able to think, if I take the person out of the head out, is the rest going to function? Is it a service, or is it something for one person, a platform for one person? Is it a personal platform, or is it an actual platform to help support the whole gamut of survivors? And I think a lot of organisations need to ask themselves this question. They really do need to ask themselves this question.
Well, they're not going to do that, Nigel, because it's status. It's about status, and it's about vested interest, and it's about all these things. And I've heard it at meetings where, people who are nationally known figures have said, "Oh, we can't have that person," or "Are they the right type of person?" And I kind of sit there and thinking, well, what's the right? I've said to him, "What's the right kind of person? Can you define them for me? Because I'd love to know." And suddenly you're the baddie, because you've dared to kind of say and challenge that kind of perspective, which is, you're okay if you're together, but, we exclude these. They don't even know these other people, but they just decided that these other people won't be a fit, and all the other stuff that goes on. And, you kind of sit there and think, and it just revolves around. And often they benefit from it because they're the ones who kind of have their face directly in the room with, the people who are making decisions at central government, for instance. So, because it's easier for central government to speak to people who project that they're speaking for everybody, when actually what they're speaking for is a group of people who kind of joined a particular group and kind of think about something. So you're not getting all the diverse voices. It's only when the diverse voices start to emerge in conversations and the policy officers start to hear it without the kind of those voices being triggered because they're being marginalised and are angry, but they're kind of just articulating stuff. And they have that time. Suddenly the lights go on, I think, that they kind of begin to realise that, in many ways, a lot of those voices are firewalled out of conversations. Those perspectives are heard, and those perspectives are often very valuable. Your perspective is not heard. My perspective is often not heard because it doesn't fit with the agenda of certain groups who want to have their voice for themselves, really. Which is wrong, isn't it? It shouldn't be like that. They are stopping the solutions often.
You're supposed to be offering a service. The only way you can offer a service is by advancing the people that you're supporting, not yourself.
I would agree with you, and I think sometimes what happens, and I've heard these conversations recently, is what happens is, and it's understandable, it happens in everything, I think. Activism is, it's not unique to sexual violence activism, male or female. Rape crisis had its own explosion inside its own systems 20-odd years ago. It's called the Federation. And the Federation kind of exploded, and from it emerged Rape Crisis England and Wales. And they learned a lot of lessons rooted in what you're saying, basically, is about kind of having lots of voices, but having very clear protocols and guidance around, we're all here for one mission. We're not here for your particular...
And a very defined mission and not going off that mission.
And that's what they did. And that's been very successful. Has its tensions, I'm sure. But that has been very, very successful for them because they've been able to... They've agreed on the central mission, which is the alleviation of sexual violence against women and children. So that is what they've agreed on. But there are tensions around the ideological differences, because feminism isn't one thing. There's multiple variations of feminist philosophy. But for males, there's also that as I don't think they ever learned that lesson. So my perspective is they've not learned. So they kind of have divisions amongst themselves and things, and kind of do. And it never exploded, but it has exploded privately, I suspect, not being publicly so visible, but it has happened. And they just carry on without learning those lessons. Perhaps women learn better lessons faster than us males. Perhaps women are better at learning the lessons. I'm not saying that from a sexist point of view. I'm just saying that from a scientific, biological view, that perhaps women are better at kind of having the explosion and having the conflict and then learning from it.
And dealing with it better.
And dealing with it. Whereas males, for lots of other reasons, have the conflict, can be very clever about things, but actually not very good at dealing with the conflict resolution stuff. Maybe, maybe that's some other stuff that goes on. So that very simplistic kind of analysis of it, maybe that's the difference. I don't know. So what your view of that would be as a therapist, Nigel?
I think it's more a case of the fact that men aren't taught to collaborate and work together on things as much as women are. To be frank, throughout their lives, right from very childhood.
Yeah.
I think girls are given, or maybe it's natural, that they have better skills at communication within a group of themselves than boys do. I think when boys, and I think this is mainly social conditioning, when boys are in a group, even as young children, there's often some kind of confrontation involved. Whereas the girls, it's like a tea party. Do you know what I mean? And that's the portrayal that comes through socially. And I think that makes it slightly... I think women have a slight advantage in thinking that way because of the social conditioning, not because of their ability to do it necessarily more, but just because of the way that we're socially conditioned.
I think, my observation of children is that, my own childhood was a sharing. I was taught to share. So I'm not sure all children are taught, but I think it's natural for human beings to share. So I don't know if women, girls share more. It was kind of natural to share. I think that kind of gets pushed out on boys, I think. Then what happens to girls about sharing?
Yeah, and I think that's about social conditioning.
The social conditioning changes the sharing thing. So it becomes more competitive, doesn't it? It's kind of doing stuff. But I think children, human beings, are natural sharers. I think we're natural sharers. I think it's the social conditioning, as you highlight, that changes it.
Yeah. No, I think that's true in a lot of things. I think our social conditioning sets us up for a lot of problems later in life. And we've got to really, somebody's got to really have a good look at education and how that education, and I'm not talking about educating just children, I'm talking about educating the parents as well, educating the people around them, just education in general on how to reduce this social conditioning, which makes for so much conflict, particularly amongst boys. The boy will be conditioned by normally his father to be strong, to be robust, to be effective, and it doesn't allow for any sort of difference or change or what they would consider weakness. And that's not the way boys are. Some are, some aren't.
I think sometimes, a lot of males that I've known in my life also teach you to be kind and fair and not to be unjust. So there's the other side of it for males that isn't often spoken about, is those messages are given as well. I think I think that's where the system goes into its default mode that this is too big to deal with. They they can't even deal with climate change, can they? So, the world's going to burn and we're all going to get flooded, and we're just hoping for a miracle.
And it's a natural evolution, and we're heading that way where it's getting better. It's certainly nowhere near where it needs to be, but
we're just about, this is being recorded, 5 or 6 days before the US election. And, the money is, it's 50-50. It depends who you speak to. But, you could have, Donald Trump as president. And yesterday there was a rally at Madison Square Gardens where they were, speakers were articulating basically that, all these coloured people from outside America are a danger to this, that, and the other. But what's interesting about when you look at the demographics of those who are voting for Trump is they're male. And females are voting for Harris, and males are voting for Trump. And the argument is going on that really what's happening is males feel.
Thank God there's 60% women over there.
Well, let's hope they all vote. So, there's a lot of women voting for Trump, but the majority of them are male, and young males in particular are going for Trump. And it's been seen as a product of this change in our culture, where women rightfully are starting to accelerate into their natural places of kind of parliament. As an example, at the moment, there are far more women in parliament now than there have ever been in history, and that's a good thing. And all of those things. But it doesn't mean to say women are going to be any better than us. What it means is that women get to have a fair crack at doing better, so that they don't.
I think we're all enriched by that because it gives a different voice.
Absolutely.
The more different voices you've got especially in a place like Parliament, the better. It can only be for the better because it brings a different standpoint and a totally different view from other people. So I think that can only be.
We'll see how that plays out after the budget. But I think that's a good thing. I think diversity is a good thing. I think groupthink is a bad thing. I think you've got to be disciplined and have the same mission. So I think that's really important. But within that mission, you can have different kind of perspectives, and they shouldn't be excluded and kind of banned for life. I think that's wrong. So all of these things, but that's a political discussion.
Well, you obviously have to have discussions as you go on as to how that mission changes, because as time evolves, that mission will change because hopefully you'll have made some progress. So the message will have to. I'm glad to say that the stuff I'm saying now isn't all the same stuff that I was saying 40 years ago. Some of it is, but a lot of it isn't. It's about a different time in space, where we're in a totally different position in some ways. And I'm glad about that, because that means that there have been changes. We have moved forward. And I think we can only look at these things as we think. Maybe I've been involved in this for 40 years. I don't know anything about a lot of abuse, particularly Ning, you were talking earlier about digital abuse. I know almost nothing about that. I've never really experienced it. So I don't know about it. But that doesn't mean I can't educate myself about it. That doesn't mean I can't learn about it. And that doesn't mean it's not an important discussion for me to be having. In fact, it's more important for me to be having because I don't know about it. And the less you're educated, the less you know, the less effective.
I think the best thing you can do as an activist is hold yourself accountable and make sure that you are educating yourself. I also think there is a huge resistance for people to educate themselves because one, they can't be bothered, two, they might then have to look in the mirror and say, actually, I've caused harm, or I've done something that's been bad. Education for me has always been a huge thing, not just in schools. I just think everyone should be educated about this, because ultimately as well, I mean, yeah, if they change the education system tomorrow and kids or secondary school children started to be educated about these topics, it wouldn't make a big enough change quickly, it would make the change so gradual, because you're missing out a whole generation of people that already exist and have been taught to live in an entirely different way. So education, just across the board, I think, can only be positive. So that's what I wanted to say about that. But I guess for a final question, I think we kind of touched on gaps, but I mean, both, I guess you can probably both answer, you might have the same answer or different, I don't know. How do you think we reach those gaps? Because, there's quite a few services out there for guys now, and I think they're very varied services as well. But we're still not reaching all the people that we know that are out there. So it's how do we reach them and how do we fill the gaps?
Well, I think how we fill the gaps is by making a duty, making it a duty of the Police and Crimes Commissioner to provide equal services or equally available services for male and female victims of abuse. And I think that's important because, yes, as we've always said, 90% of abuse is suffered by women. It's important that those services are bigger and have more funding. But it's also important that the male survivors aren't left out in that. And we have to be careful with organisations becoming too focused on, I think, one sex. Because we have to have a grip on reality. And that grip on reality is about knowing about all types of abuse and trying to deal with all types of abuse. So I think we could fill the gap by putting a mandatory duty on the Police and Crime Commissioners to provide decent services across the board. Then the rural ones can't get away with saying, well, we just can't do that because we're rural, which is what they do at the moment.
I think it's about something that you've touched as well, about collaboration. So I don't think, some people say you should have one giant super agency that does everything. I don't think that's a good thing. I think that kind of takes away choice. So I think you need to have not thousands of different agencies, but I think you need to have choice for survivors. And I think sometimes you need to have spaces that are male only or kind of work as male only, and some are female only. But also I think you need to kind of have that place in the middle where can kind of just feel.
I think that is actually very, very important that you've got male only and female only spaces. I think that female spaces have been sort of getting towards being eroded recently, and I haven't liked that. I haven't felt comfortable with that. It's really important that there are women only spaces, but it's just as important there are men only spaces.
So doing that, it requires funding. And then it's smart collaboration, basically, so that you work together rather than work against each other. So someone once described it's resources, and then kind of putting the parameters for the use of those resources down. And then it's people being professional in the way they use it. And as you rightly pointed out, actually being there for who matters, which is the people who you're supposed to be serving, rather than yourself. You need to be paid. Everyone needs to be looked after. I know sometimes you've had a discussion about being paid. But if you're doing a job, you need to be paid. And there's hundreds and hundreds of guys, though, out there in rural Norfolk, in Cumbria, in Northumberland, wherever you want to go, middle of Wales, where there are services, but they don't necessarily work for them because they don't, as you are, pointed out, they may just give them a very limited choice. So you need to work smarter and kind of use resources.
And not be afraid of sharing some resources. Not being afraid of sharing some resources, which we can share, buildings and things like this. There can be shared spaces, which are male only 1 or 2 days a week, female the other 5 days. So you've got some kind of balance with the amount of survivors you've got, with the amount of services you've got. So those shared spaces, those shared resources are easier to to be used to the best for the community.
So I come from the same school of thought as you, Nigel, so I'm just strangely talking to Niamh about something this afternoon, whereas we kind of come together and kind of use resources in a collaborative way. So we might have 10 grand for something and they have 10 grand for something. If you put the 2 grands together, you've got 20 grand to do something together that actually works for everybody.
You can do something a bit better.
You could do something a bit better that works better. And everybody's a winner, especially the people that you're working for. I can guarantee you that is a difficult conversation, not for those of us who are willing to do that, but actually for most services, as you described, they don't want to do that. They don't want to share.
I've been dealing with difficult conversations all my life. I've had so many difficult conversations with organisations and MPs and all sorts of other people. Yes, life is about having awkward conversations. Yes, it's about making difficult decisions and doing sometimes things that you're not fully comfortable with, but you see as a necessity to get your eventual aim. And we've got to remember the eventual aim. The eventual aim is survivors.
So, you have to be pragmatic at times. The only thing about pragmatism is that some people use it as a kind of excuse for kind of, doing things that I think are unethical. But when they kind of use it, well, you've got to be pragmatic and you've got to do this. I think sometimes you have to remember your principles and your values, and you have to stick to those, and you can be pragmatic around it. But going back to the question, is what I think, is smart, well-funded, supported government, central government, linked to local PCCs with a duty, as you're rightly pointing out, with the big kind of truth sitting on the table, is that everybody can get paid, everyone can have their service. It's not unlimited. Nobody's going to give you £1 million so you can have unlimited therapy for every individual. It's just never going to happen. But what you can have is, the best, good enough, and deliver it better, and use technology. So we use technology mostly. So rural is not a big difficulty for us. So you can give someone a mobile telephone. You can video counsel in, whether the arguments about video counselling and offline counselling are interesting, but the data is very clear, kind of has the same impact if it's the right therapist. So, all of that.
If it's right for the right.
For those people who want it. So for people who want, a majority of our clients want it. So it's kind of, for those who don't want it, you need to have provision for that. Much more difficult in rural areas because of the travel distance.
I think that's going to be more the older generation. I think the younger generation coming up are so attached to their digital world. My little there's a little girl called Charlotte from a friend of mine, and I watched her. She's 2 years old, and she already knows how to use an iPad. So when young people are growing up with that technology enhanced, entrenched in their lives so much, I think it's much easier for them to communicate in that way, online, and that will be the future for sure.
So I still think there's provision for offline. I think offline we still need human contact in that physical space, because something else does happen in that. I don't think it's significant enough to kind of impact the overall outcomes for counselling, but I think it adds something in the group element that might develop from it and stuff that might be added value. So anyway, that's part of the mix, I think. And there's smart ways around kind of doing offline counselling in rural areas. It just requires more resources. So there's that, because the travelling thing is the hard bit. But if there's enough money, you could pay for someone's taxi, can't you? So, if there's money to do it, you could do it for those who wanted to do it. So all of those things, but that comes down to resources. So I think it's about being smarter, and I think it's about facing up to strategies. Hopefully those conversations are actually going somewhere, and they're really going to roll those out next year. More funding. Hopefully there will be more funding. It's got more tax coming. So hopefully there's more kind of funding coming for sexual violence. At least if they reduce the amount of money for sexual violence, and hopefully that will increase. So you can start doing and taking some of the competitive forces out of it. So there is a duty to collaborate now, which is meant to be driven, but it's more about systems collaborating than it is about third sector services collaborating. But the logic of that is that we should all collaborate and share resources and actually work together to kind of benefit our beneficiaries. That's the ideal, isn't it? Not what really
That's the ideal, because that's what our eventual aim is, or should be. Our eventual aim should be the advancement of the people we're working for.
Our eventual aim should be to put ourselves out of business.
Yeah.
Is to deal with the legacies downstream, but also to be acting as that campaigning collective voice to impart knowledge into the system, so we can start to diminish the amount of people who are coming in, children coming into upstream. So it's about protection.
Nobody wishes more than I do that I've made myself obsolete by now.
Mm.
It would be nice, wouldn't it? So, to be
It would be nice. 40 years ago, I could have said, okay, in 40 years, I won't have to do any of this anymore because it'll all be perfect. 40 years down the line, man, we're still going.
We're coming to the end, Nigel, but I wanted to say something to you, because I don't know if hopefully we'll bump into each other again at some stage in the real world, and I can buy you a coffee or a pint of beer, whatever your thing you like. And it's like, to say to you that people should look very carefully at what you did 40 years ago. Even Red Crisis were a couple of young women who were operating out of work they could find at that time. Some of them are still around. They're coming up to retirement. There's not many of them left. But they were young women who were 16, 17, who were creating rape crisis centres at that time. You were, I forget how old you were a young man. You were trying to do something in the middle of a big city that didn't really want to know. So all of those things. And we should not forget. We should not forget where all of this began. And the wisdom that you come out with, which about kind of the lessons learned over 40 years, should be heard by some of those who now position themselves as leaders, of males in particular. Because what you're saying, I think, is absolutely on the money, that we will not reverse all of this by being individualistic kind of competitors. We will only do it if we work together, and that voice comes together. And I'm not sure some of those people are listening to that. So they're kind of more interested in their solution. They're the one. It can only be one.
And it's not one. It's not one. It's everyone. It's not one. It's everyone.
They don't see it like that, though, Nigel. They don't. You know that. I know it. You know them. You've met the people over the years.
That's the big next change in our society that's got to happen. In our community, in our society, that's the next change that's got to happen.
Yeah. Because
unless we've got a firm, clear voice, and I don't think it should be separate from female survivors. I've always been passionate about male survivors. I've also always been passionate about female survivors as well. And it's important that we stop this gender argument. There is a gender argument being used against us to keep us separate, and it's worked for decades. And it's about time we rose above that as organisations.
There are some women that I know kind of are getting that, but at the same time, they still think there are other women who are on that mission, so they see it as that mission. So I think, and the male groupings, kind of they're at war with each other often. So there's kind of underneath the surface. So you have all of that going on.
That's why I think that's the next step. It's our next step in the evolution of survivors.
I think the next step is kind of have the right leaders who can kind of have that wisdom to have those conversations and to be diplomatic, to do diplomacy. That's what Rape Crisis does. They do diplomacy. They kind of have a kind of philosophy. They talk to the disparate kind of groupings within that larger collective, and they have these conversations that we're having, which is, what is this all about? Great, your service gets £1 million, you get £2 million because you've got all the demand, that's cool. But actually, if you're killing the service next to you because they're the service you've got 350 quid more than you thought you should get, they got a bit of your money, then what is that about? So, you should be helping other services. But if they're competing with you and trying to destroy you because they want to get your 2 million quid, it's mad. It's kind of crazy,
And that's the way it's framed with the restricted pot of cash.
It is, yeah. So hopefully that, those conversations are going on. I'm not part of those conversations, but hopefully those conversations, it is about money. And then decision makers have a moral choice. They can either then give it all to the faction they love, or they can start doing what you really mapped out well, which is start dealing with the entirety of the issue and dealing with it based on real informed kind of advice. So they really start to turn it around rather than just turn around their ideology to give themselves a party.
And have a clear objective.
And measured and kind of do it and start to... Then people, I think, I think most people have goodwill till all this change will come together and start battling for it. Whereas at the moment, it's what's in it for me rather than what's in it for us. And that's the barrier to change. That's what really needs to happen. So I want to thank you, Nigel. I want to thank you personally as a male survivor for kind of doing that thing 40 years ago and to be there and kind of still be kind of articulating those very difficult things to say because, some people don't like you saying it. And I hope it comes to fruition. I certainly advocate for it when I can ever have a chance to talk about it to them. And I do get
I don't think I'm very effective if somebody doesn't agree with me.
Yeah, I think you have to learn.
If nobody disagrees with me, I don't think I'm being very effective.
Yeah, I think that's right. You need to have people who have different perspectives. And then you need to kind of navigate into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I welcome them.
I think you need to know what the mission is and you need to kind of drive it. So be very careful. I know Ray Prices have learned about consensus processes. The problem with consensus processes is it can go in a circle for about 20,000 years and you're not kind of moving forward. So you need to kind of have a very quick process of reaching a consensus, and it needs to be a majority consensus, and it needs to kind of be, people need to be honest about why they're objecting about it and have a different and put a solution rather than just say, I don't like it. Well, what's your solution to it then? How would you go about changing these and achieving these objectives? Because that's what should happen. And then kind of not chuck them out because they have a different view, which is what happens.
But first of all, you need the forum to do that.
You need the right structures, you need the professionalism, it's a word that people don't like, but you need the kind of professional structures, you need the right people running it, and you need, in some ways, you need the egos to be managed in a space that has protocols to manage them. And then they kind of all agree and stuff, rather than some egos dominating more than others. That's the answer.
We are always dealing with damaged people.
Injury, isn't it? And there's some people are kind of more aware of their injury and have done the work to try to mitigate what it kind of, the limp, basically. If you want
sometimes we have to take a step back and see whether that attack was personal or whether it was led by that person's own situation.
And it's hard, isn't it? Because if you're articulating views that, are pushing the conversation, and people want, kind of want it to be, they just want it because they've got vested interests often in that kind of conversation not being pushed because it rocks the boat with decision makers. Then, I think you can rock the boat if that's the right word. I think, I always believed that breaking the silence, I get breaking the silence. So I broke my own silence. And it was a very, very painful thing to do in a world that wasn't really welcoming to that breaking. What I learned from that, because I was surprised by it, to be honest with you, because I've not really looked at my own kind of disclosure, because I was kind of bubbling along in my own compartmentalization. But when it kind of shattered, And I realised the way I was dealt with and the responses to me. I realised it wasn't about me breaking the silence. It was about the challenging of the societal silence. And it's only when that's challenged and shattered that breaking the silence becomes actually not particularly an issue for people, because they're invited to break. Actually, everything about the society is saying you can break your silence whenever you want, and you'll be safe with us, and we're waiting for you. Whereas at the moment, breaking your silence is almost like an act of revolution. It's like forcing yourself into a battlefield where you don't even know where the snipers are. So a lot of survivors who go out there and do the public speaking and discover that. So you kind of have to be so I think, I get it, but I think the real battle is what you were saying at the very beginning. It's about collectivizing and putting two fingers up to the divide and rule thing, and kind of just working together collectively to change it, including delivering better services, including services, and rolling out all of that. We're also having that kind of political with a small p conversation. And if you do that in partnership with women as well, then really you can start to shift everything, I think. Because men are the ones who can bring men into the conversation. So men can do that. Women are going to struggle to bring a lot of males into that conversation, because that's not a conversation they feel belongs to them. But if males are joined together in the conversation without dominating, because that's what happened in the LGBT movement back in the 80s, wasn't it? That women and men got together. Yeah. But some guys in the LGBT movement decided they were going to run the female emancipation movement as well as the LGBT emancipation movement. And that's what caused all the battles in history. So you need to learn about all of that. You need to know history. So we need people who know where it went wrong, how it didn't work, and what you need to learn about how to navigate it all to make it work. Because those conversations to be open and had, because that's history. It kind of happened. And, it's put things back. It stopped things because people wanted to control things rather than collaborate on things and truly work together to change it. We've got the longest podcast in the history of our Konsuki conversations. But I've really enjoyed speaking to you. So I'm sorry we didn't have much more time when I visited the National Inquiry when I went to London all those years ago to spend more time, because you were lost in the eye of the storm down in that inquiry where people and stuff. So it's been nicer to have these conversations. So hopefully one day we'll have that. So there'll be spaces for us to have these conversations with other people who I think are of goodwill, who really want to kind of see this stuff and realise that it doesn't get us anywhere. I think there's a lot more of those emerging, because I think that change needs to happen. On that note, I'm going to say thank you, Nigel. Niamh, do you want to have the final word?
Just to echo what you said, Rob, just thanking you, Nigel, for kind of all the work that you've done over the years. And I think it's really wonderful to see that you still just persevere with it and the passion's still there. And I do think it's really important, especially for people like my age, to listen to you and like Rob said earlier, listen where it went wrong and what you think needs to still be done and things like that, because you learn from others and again, if we're all together, that's the best way to make change. But yeah, and it's great to chat with you as well. It's really great to hear just what you think about things.
Well, thank you very much, both of you, for your kind words. I'm really so pleased to have done these conversations with you.
It's been lovely speaking to you. So I'll say thank you very much. And we'll close down another Konsuki Conversations, which I've really enjoyed. And it's been really, really, really good to hear those kind of reflections. So thank you again.